Welcome to another episode of Monster Monday from the Ready to Die channel. This series explores the design of a creature I have built for Pathfinder 2nd Edition. The stat block for this creature can be found over on the Monster Monday blog, as well as the Twitter and Discord, all of which are linked below. What was the last Monster Hunter creature I built? Gammoth, I think. It does feel like it's been longer than that, but we are back on the rise as we return to the wild world of Monster Hunter to set up the sinister slasher, the Shogun Ceanataur. The Shogun Ceanataur. Now, not only am I following up last week's build with another crustacean, but it even uses the same level, which was determined after much confusion and consternation over on the Monster Monday Discord. This being a creature that I personally have not faced before in any of the Monster Hunter games, I turned to the fantastic folks over there for suggestions on what level to make this creature that is essentially a mix between a hermit crab and a praying mantis that's been hit by Rita Repulsa's Dora Scepter. I got a few answers and they kind of ranged all the way from level 6 to like level 12 or something, and it wasn't very helpful. I ended up going somewhere in between the two by relating it to other monsters, but while I might be a little shaky on the level, I am confident in both the general design and numbers of this creature, so if you think it should be a different level, simply adjust those numbers appropriately. And watching this video will make it easy on you because we're going to go over all of those numbers right here. But real quick, before we get into that, I want to mention that I'm sticking with the beast trait for the Shogun Ceanataur, referencing how some Ceanataurs are smart enough to use the skulls they select and shells in new and interesting ways. For example, the Rustraiser Ceanataur will wear glavenus skulls, and use them the same way that the glavenus does to sharpen its tail. This might be a bit of a stretch in this whole concept, since we also have primates that can figure out tool usage, but don't get the beast trait. I could understand going either point, but having it be beast or animal, and I guess the more consistent trait is its amphibious trait, as we find this thing regularly out from under the sea. With that covered, we can go ahead and get to the numbers, starting of course with the basics of it all. As a general note, I mostly followed the soldier roadmap for this creature, based on its quick reactions and skillful strikes. We do start down this road with a high strength, which will facilitate the Ceanataur's primary fighting style. While mighty, it is also a surprisingly nimble combatant, which also lends to the use of a moderate dexterity. It rounds out its positive ability scores with a low constitution and wisdom. It is largely reliant upon its shell for protection, and demonstrates some cleverness, but it's mostly just a wild creature. Now, while it is only using a low wisdom, it is still a hunting creature and it uses a moderate perception to facilitate that to help it seek out prey. As it has a burrow speed, it does also use an imprecise tremor sense so that it can detect creatures moving around above it. It has a small assortment of skills with a high athletics mostly to support its maneuverability, whether that be swimming, climbing, or even leaping. A moderate acrobatics will help it scuttle across uneven terrain, and then it can use its low stealth to possibly pull off the disappearing act that it does during its intro for Rise. One of the biggest changes to the Shogun Ceanataur during the Monster Mash were those made to its defenses, so let's go ahead and dive into those. The Ceanataur is equipped with a high armor class, which is an important aspect of a later part of its kit. For now though, this just represents both its shell and the skull it wears like a hermit crab. As a fairly sturdy creature, it utilizes a high pool of hit points, as well in part because it has a weakness to both electricity and fire, both of which are fairly common damaging elements. On the topic of weaknesses and its hit points, I do need to discuss its skull armor. I usually save the discussion of abilities for after all the number talk, but this is directly related to its defensive stats. The skull armor is based off of the construct armor of animated objects, as well as the ship armor of Tahia Lai, the Thief of Ships. It grants the Ceanataur hardness, reducing all damage until the Ceanataur itself is also reduced to half health or lower, shattering the skull and revealing the vulnerable body within. This adds quite a bit of defense to the Shogun Ceanataur, but my test subjects and I thought that it felt fine. As for its saving throws, I couldn't really nail down which to lean into, and instead just use a moderate bonus for all of them. This makes it a little monk-like in its design, but I wasn't quite sure which to drop or even which would be exceptional for the creature. This was kind of me just settling. But with that covered, we can start digging into the Shogun Ceanataur's attacks, and at first glance, we only have one attack to talk about. The Ceanataur typically fights with its blade-like claws folded, which are represented through the folded claw strike, lacking any special traits or tricks, but equipped with a high attack bonus and a high damage value. This makes it a fairly capable striker, but the Ceanataur can become even deadlier by using its Extend Claws ability. As a single action, this features the Manipulate trait and does trigger reactive strikes, but using it causes the Ceanataur to gain its Sickle Claw strike. This strike has a high attack, same as its Folded Claw, but comes with extreme damage. The Sickle Claw also has the Deadly and Reach traits to reflect the reach of these claws and the sharpness of the weapons made from them. In return for gaining these claws, the Ceanataur leaves itself exposed, a little off balance and vulnerable, reducing its AC through the off-guard condition, until it's at a point just below low AC for its level. This changes the Ceanataur into something of a glass cannon. It dished out a ton of damage during the test, but was taking a lot of hits in exchange. After some discussion with my test subjects, we also slipped some action compression into this in what I think is a fairly unique manner. The Shogun Ceanataur can choose to add the Flourish trait to this action, and doing so allows it to make a strike as part of it, and this does enable other aspects of its kit, and fits in nicely. Now with that, because it requires the Flourish trait to activate, it can't do this again, so it can't Flourish trait, strike with its Extended Claw, switch back with a Flourish trait, and hit with a Folded Claw. It's gotta be one or the other. Now also of note, if you want to play into the Ceanataur's craftiness, it might trigger Extend Claws with a Flourish trait, follow that up with a second strike, and then if it's against a rogue or something, use Extend Claws again so it can go back to its Folded Claws and a higher armor class. Alternatively, if the Ceanataur lands both of these strikes, it could instead go for a Ripping Rend. This behaves much like the Rend action, but instead of just inflicting claw damage, it inflicts Persistent Bleed, which is inspired by the bleed that the Ceanataur is able to deal in Monster Hunter Rise. I'm not sure if it did so in older games, I couldn't find any mention of it, but it is something that I certainly noticed while I was doing research. The other way that the Shogun Ceanataur can use its sickle blades is with the Whirling Blades 3-action activity. The last monster I built borrowed from the Ranger and Inventor, and this one takes from the Fighter, specifically being based on the Whirlwind attack feat. Now this is a much higher level feat than what this creature is, and while that isn't always indicative of power, I didn't want to put too much juice into this feature and added the caveat that all these strikes are made at a -2, which lowers it to a moderate attack bonus. Given the reach of these claws, this is certainly deadly when it has 3 or more enemies within reach, and the hard part is always balancing it to make sure that this reaction activity isn't always the best option for it to do. Stepping outside of its use of claw blades, the Shogun Ceanataur can also launch pressurized beams of piss, water, from its skull, which I translated into a fairly standard line effect that deals limited use area damage with a high DC save. There's not a ton to cover in regards to this, but in Monster Hunter, the Ceanataur does need a skull to properly channel this blast. So when it loses its skull armor, it can no longer use this effect. There is one more thing I do want to mention. There's a tactic that the Ceanataur demonstrates that is kind of neat. Sometimes, in the midst of a fight, it will spring onto a ceiling, which our version can do thanks to the Uncanny Climber feature, and then blast at enemies from there. It's nothing too crazy, but it's a fun little concept, and the Ceanataur is surprisingly versatile in its movement. As a crab, it can obviously swim, but it also demonstrates the ability to climb upon walls and burrow through the earth, letting it attack from multiple different angles. Also, just want to slip it in there, I want to mention right now, that the Shogun Ceanataur also has the Reactive Strike, borrowing even more from the Fighter, and fitting into the Soldier roadmap that I was using for it. Finalizing this ably armed arthropod's arsenal is Move Home. Much like how Skull Armor is based on Tahili's ship armor, this is pretty much exactly borrowed from her action of the same name. This restores the Ceanataur's hardness until it is once more reduced to half health, and its shell is again cracked. Now, to be perfectly honest, the Ceanataur probably won't get a chance to use this unless the GM sets it up beforehand. But there's some fun things you could do with it, which I'll get into in the closing statements, which we have finally arrived at. With slices and slashes, this sinister Ceanataur severs souls from soldiers with sublime swiftness and skill. This is a great threat to throw at a party that's getting a little too careless with their movement. They're starting to forget that some enemies do have reactive strikes that they will bring to bear against them. It can switch from a safer mode with its folded claws to a glass cannon when it becomes enraged by popping out those sickle blades. But if you need a bit more reason to use this critter carving crustacean, consider the idea of letting those skulls it carries give it something a little extra. This is explored in Monster Hunter specifically, with the Gravio skull letting it blast out the beam of water, and the Glavenus skull of the Rust Razor letting it sharpen its claws. I definitely think that's an idea that can be expanded upon, but I didn't want to take too many liberties with this lashing lobster. Be sure to let me know what you think of this monster and what other creatures you'd like to see down in a comment. You can check out the blog or Twitter, linked below, to see other versions of this creature as well as some discussions on encounter hooks. Thanks for watching, and have a monstrous Monday.